gold piled high, beneath erupting volcanoes. This is the sun's secret symphony of chaos.
Welcome to the deep dive. You know, we spend so much time digging into interest rates, inflation, political moves.
Yeah, the usual suspect.
Exactly. But what if some of the biggest forces hitting our economies, maybe even shaping history itself, are, well, bigger, more cosmic?
Way bigger.
Today, we're diving into some really intriguing sources that point to something pretty fundamental: the sun.
Our star, yeah. Hard to get more fundamental than that.
So our mission is to unpack these, frankly, surprising connections. We'll look at the evidence and try to figure out what this all means for you as someone trying to make sense of the world.
And maybe even for navigating the economy.
Yeah.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so cycles. We all get cycles, right? Seasons turn, days have rhythms.
Absolutely. Nature loves a pattern.
And in finance, we always talk about the business cycle: expansion, peak, bust.
Contraction, trough, yeah. The standard economic heartbeat.
And we usually think that's driven by human stuff, you know, like psychology, credit, government policy.
Very much earthbound explanations.
Right.
Booms and busts driven by our own behavior.
But what if there's another layer? A deeper rhythm coming from, well, space.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How these earthly cycles might actually dance to a cosmic beat. Our main source today really leans into this, pointing straight at the solar cycle.
Which he calls the sun's mood swing.
Exactly. It's roughly an 11-year cycle, and it's all driven by the sun's incredibly complex magnetic field twisting and turning.
And that causes stuff. Big stuff.
Oh, yeah. It leads to everything from quiet periods to massive solar flares and these things called coronal mass ejections.
Ah, the giant plasma burp.
That's the one. Just huge clouds of plasma blasted out into space. We track all this activity by counting sunspots.
Those darker patches.
Right. Caused by intense magnetic activity. When the sun's covered in them, that's solar maximum peak activity.
And solar minimum is when it's quiet, nearly spotless.
Precisely. And right now we're in cycle 25. It kicks off back in December 2019.
Okay.
It seems to have peaked around October 2024, and it should calm down by about 2030.
And how's this cycle been? Average? Wild?
Interestingly, it's been fierier than forecasted. Initial predictions were for a peak around 115 sunspots, but it passed that.
So more active than expected.
Definitely more active than expected, but still not as intense as some cycles we saw back in the 20th century. So lively, but not a record smasher.
Okay, so the sun's got this big 11-year dramatic cycle that's quite the backdrop. But has anyone really tried to connect that to something like, say, the economy here on Earth? It sounds a bit out there.
It does sound wild, but yeah, people have definitely tried. And not just recently. Well, back in the 19th century, there was a British economist, William Stanley Jevons, quite prominent.
Okay.
He noticed that what he called commercial crises, basically recessions, seemed to line up kind of uncannily with this 10 to 11-year solar cycle.
Really? What was his theory?
He called it a beautiful coincidence, but he thought solar flares maybe messed with the weather, ruined harvests.
Ah, the agricultural link.
Exactly. Bad harvests, market crashes. It was an early sort of astroeconomic theory.
Interesting. But was he the only one?
Well, not at all. Jevons was just dipping his toes in. Then came Alexander Chizhevsky, or Russian scientist.
Okay.
He took it way, way further. Chizhevsky looked at the sun and basically saw the driver of human history.
Wow. How so?
He argued that solar maximums weren't just linked to recessions, but to peaks in revolutions, wars, and general mayhem.
Seriously? Revolutions?
Yeah. He charted centuries of conflict and upheaval from like 500 BC all the way to 1922 against sunspot records.
He found
What the source calls a suspicious number of uprisings. When the sun was really active, really blotchy.
That's quite a claim.
He even broke it down into 4 phases tied to the cycle. Started with sleepy authoritarianism, then political organizing, escalating to full-blown revolutions at the peak, and finally burnout and apathy as the sun quieted down.
So like humanity itself was on a cycle.
Pretty much. He described it as humanity on an 11-year caffeine binge, fueled by the sun. A very vivid image.
Okay, those are some wild historical theories. Jevons and Chizhevsky. It sounds like something out of, I don't know, an epic novel.
Right. Very grand scope.
But does any of this actually hold water today? When we look at modern data, is there anything solid behind it? Because our source uses this phrase, that the sun might have been moonlighting as an economic hitman.
It's a provocative phrase, for sure.
Yeah.
And the statistics presented are actually quite startling.
How so?
Well, look at the period 1901 to 2008. The source claims that nearly every solar maximum synced suspiciously well with a U.S. recession.
Nearly every one.
That's what it says. Across 10 solar cycles in that time, 11 U.S. recessions started within a cozy 2-year window around the solar max peak, just before or just after.
Wow. What are the odds of that just being chance?
According to the analysis, less than 0.1%. The source jokes it's about the same chance as a Fed chair admitting they're just winging it.
Okay, that's statistically significant, to say the least.
It really is.
But
And it gets even more interesting after 1933, post-Depression.
how did it change?
The link actually got tighter. 8 out of 13 recessions after the Depression hit right in that solar maximum window. Before the 30s, in the 19th century, it was apparently more freestyle.
Huh. Why the change? Any ideas?
The theory put forward is that the Great Depression led to huge government intervention, stimulus,
Right, trying to manage the cycle.
exactly,
Yeah.
which made recessions maybe shorter, less frequent,
Mm-hmm.
unless, the source suggests, the sun sort of demanded it.
Yeah.
Like policy could smooth things out, but not override this bigger solar cycle influence.
Okay, so it's not just whether a recession happens, but other economic signals, too.
Yes, exactly. It's broader than just recessions hitting the calendar.
What else lines up?
Well, take the OECD Composite Leading Indicator, CLIs. They're meant to predict economic turns.
Right.
For the U.S., from 1955 to 2008, these CLIs consistently dropped in the 3 years around the solar peak. They typically bottomed out about 2.5 years after the peak.
A consistent dip.
A clear negative correlation, yeah, with about a 24-month lag. And it wasn't just the U.S. Similar patterns showed up across the G7.
Except Japan, you mentioned.
Right. Japan seemed to be an exception, interestingly. But it held for broader OECD and BRICS economies, too.
Mm-hmm.
And other indexes, like the Aruba-Diebold Scotty Business Conditions Index. Same story. Weaker than average conditions in the 3 years after solar maximums.
Okay, leading indicators, business conditions. What about things like jobs or overall growth?
Same pattern showing up. Unemployment data, looking from 1948 to 2014 in the U.S.
Yeah.
Every U.S. solar maximum lined up closely with a low point in unemployment. But then, a sharp rise followed, usually peaking 2 to 3 years later.
So good news followed by bad news. Time with the cycle.
Pretty consistently, Canada showed a similar pattern. Japan, again, less so, maybe due to its unique labor market.
And GDP, the big picture.
U.S. GDP growth rates also tended to weaken in the 3 years after solar peaks, looking at data from 1954 to 2008. And that pattern held when you aggregated G7, advanced economies, and even global GDP.
Wow. So across the board, really. Recessions, indicators, jobs, growth.
It paints a pretty compelling picture, doesn't it?
It really does. So the takeaway isn't that the sun, directly manages your stock portfolio.
No, definitely not that literal.
But that its cycle seems to cast this long shadow over the entire global business cycle. Solar maximums consistently signaling tougher times ahead.
That seems to be the core argument, yeah. A kind of cosmic early warning system for economic slowdowns and rising unemployment baked into the solar system itself.
Okay, that's a mountain of stuff linking solar maximums to economic stress. But what about the flip side? Solar minimums. When the sun's quiet.
Ah, the quiet phase.
Does anything happen then? Or is it just quiet? The source has this great line about it being Mother Nature quietly prepping for her next plot twist.
Yeah, that's a good one. And it turns out quiet for the sun might not mean quiet for us. The minimum phase, described as the sun's version of a Netflix and chill phase, might actually have some pretty dramatic consequences down here.
Like what?
Well, the research highlighted points to a strong inverse relationship, a correlation of minus 0.72, which is pretty high between sunspot activity and major volcanic eruptions.
Wait, inverse. So fewer sunspots.
Seems to correlate with more big volcanic eruptions. A quieter sun might mean a more geologically active Earth.
Whoa, how would that even work? What's the proposed mechanism?
It's complex, but the idea involves the solar wind, that stream of charged particles from the sun. During a minimum, the solar wind is weaker and the sun's magnetic field is less potent.
Okay.
This allows more high-energy cosmic rays from deep space to penetrate our atmosphere. These rays can apparently influence things like cloud formation, atmospheric pressure.
Which affects geology somehow.
Potentially, yeah. Subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure could, theoretically, influence stresses on tectonic plates. Plus, lower solar activity might affect Earth's magnetic field and upper atmosphere temperatures, contributing to instability. The source calls it magnetized solar wind mucking about with Earth's geology.
Mucking about. Okay. Is there historical evidence for this volcano link?
There seems to be. Looking back over the last 2,500 years, periods with lower average sunspot numbers tend to coincide with periods of increased volcanic activity.
A long-term pattern.
Exactly. Some data even suggests a kind of tipping point. If the sunspot average drops below about 17, the likelihood of major eruptions seems to increase significantly. Earth gets a fireworks show from beneath, as the source puts it.
A fireworks show from beneath. That's quite an image. Is there a big historical example of this kind of solar minimum, volcanic maximum event?
Oh, absolutely. The classic example is Mount Tambora in Indonesia, 1815.
Tambora, right, that was huge.
Colossal. A VEI-7 eruption near the top of the scale. It killed tens of thousands, directly wiped out homes.
Terrible.
But the global impact was the real story. The ash and aerosols blocked sunlight, causing the infamous year without a summer in 1816.
I've heard of that, global cooling.
Yes, significant global cooling. It led to widespread crop failures, famine across the northern hemisphere, probably triggered the first global cholera pandemic.
And economic impact.
Definitely. A major economic slump, particularly in the U.S. And crucially, this all happened during the Dalton minimum, a known period of unusually low solar activity.
So the sun was quiet and the earth erupted, causing global chaos.
That's the connection drawn. And it's not just a one-off. These solar minimums, combined with major eruptions, can trigger what's called a volcanic winter.
More than just one bad year.
Right. And on top of that, low solar activity might also slow down the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC.
The Gulf Stream, basically.
Yeah, helps keep Europe and North America warmer. Slow that down, and things get even colder. It's described as a potential cocktail of climatic chaos.
Okay, this is a lot. Cosmic cycles, recessions, revolutions, volcanoes, climate shifts. How does this connect to what we're seeing now? In today's economy, the source mentions something about Trump-era stagflation potentially returning.
Right. It tries to bring these big cycles down to the present day. And one of the most direct connections highlighted is food inflation and scarcity.
Food prices. Okay, that feels very real.
Extremely real. The source uses Japan's current rice apocalypse as a case study.
Rice apocalypse. Sounds dramatic.
It is, apparently. The price for 5 kilograms of rice reportedly shot up from around $2,168 in January 2024 to maybe $4,200 by spring 2025. That's roughly double.
Wow. How are they coping?
The government's had to repeatedly raid its emergency rice reserves, releasing something like 800,000 metric tons since March just to try and stabilize prices. Farmers are protesting, and the next harvest is looking like it could be the smallest planted area since 1900.
A potential disaster.
And this is all happening while Japan's also grappling with the potential sovereign debt crisis. So multiple pressures converging.
And this isn't just Japan, right? This points to broader inflation.
Exactly. Rising food and agricultural commodity prices are a major global inflation driver. The Bloomberg Agriculture Commodity Index, for example, has been climbing. That's a key signal.
Are there other indicators the source points to suggesting this inflationary pressure is serious?
Yes. It highlights a couple of key ratios it considers less prone to manipulation or propaganda spin.
Okay, like what?
One is the gold to U.S. Treasury ratio. Basically, how much people trust gold versus government bonds.
And what's it saying?
When that ratio is above its 7-year moving average, as it apparently is now, the source interprets that as the U.S. economy swimming in an inflationary sea. Investors are seeking shelter in hard assets.
A flight to safety or perceived safety?
Right. The other one mentioned is the S&P 500 to oil ratio, linked to the Ag Commodity Index. It's presented as another unbiased gauge of whether the economy is healthy or heading for trouble.
So putting it all together, the solar cycle history, the current food inflation, these ratios.
The conclusion drawn in the material is pretty stark. Solar minimums potentially ushering in crisis, maybe war cycles heating up. It suggests we fundamentally can't bend the business cycle to our will. These larger forces are at play.
Okay, so if these cycles are so powerful and we might be facing, an inflationary bust potentially linked to solar minimums and other factors, what's the advice? For investors, for individuals? The source talks about shifting focus from return on capital.
To return to capital. Exactly. Preservation becomes key.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, first and foremost, real assets. Physical gold and silver are heavily emphasized, called the only truly anti-fragile stores of value.
Why physical?
No counterparty, no nonsense, no digital surveillance is the reasoning given. Platinum and palladium also get mentioned. And for real autonomy, things like private vaults or old numismatic coins like pre-1965 silver coins.
Got it. Hard assets outside the system. What about cash or bonds?
Cash management is key, but selectively.
Mm-hmm.
The advice is very short duration, high quality debt. Think investment-grade U.S. dollar bonds under 12 months or T-bills under 3 months. Get some income, stay flexible.
And long-term bonds.
Avoided. Called an uninvestable, returnless asset class in this environment. Too much risk, not enough potential reward.
Okay, what about stocks, equities?
The focus there shifts to quality and resilience. Lean, low-leverage businesses with strong EPS and free cash flow.
Makes sense. Any specific sectors?
Yeah, especially companies that actually pay taxes and might benefit from trends like trade wars or reindustrialization. Prioritize energy and commodity producers over consumers.
Producers.
And there's a specific focus on agriculture, given the food inflation angle. The MVIS Global Agribusiness Index, or ETFs like MOO, are mentioned as ways to play global food inflation. Even specific companies like Mosaic, a big fertilizer producer.
So direct plays on the things becoming scarce or expensive.
Exactly. Commodities themselves are tricky, called treacherous, but essential. Physical is hard, futures need expertise, ETFs have counterparty risk,
Wow.
but agriculture exposure is seen as almost like lifeline insurance.
Yeah, the advice gets pretty practical, even bordering on lifestyle changes. Stocking 12 to 24 months of food is called prudent?
That's significant stockpiling.
It is. And even more dramatically, it suggests considering escaping cities, maybe securing farmland in law-abiding, far-flung corners, and focusing on building strong, self-reliant communities. Wow, that's a major shift. Basically, prepare for significant disruption.
That seems to be the underlying message. Expect higher volatility, expect dull inflation-adjusted returns in traditional markets, and the source notes that even go as of June 2025, the U.S. might look like it's in an inflationary boom. Indicators like that S&P 500 to gold ratio are apparently signaling an inflationary bust could be coming much sooner.
We have covered a lot today. I mean, from the sun's magnetic field all the way to revolutions, recessions, volcanoes, and the price of rice in Japan right now.
It's a huge canvas connecting the cosmic to the everyday.
It really is. And the core idea that these vast solar rhythms could be subtly, or maybe not so subtly, influencing our economy, our society, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
It absolutely challenges the standard view.
This deep dive, it feels like it's uncovered this potential secret symphony of chaos, as the source calls it, playing out above us, maybe orchestrating things we usually blame solely on human action or policy.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a different perspective on cause and effect in the world.
So as we wrap this up, what's maybe one thing from all this that you think people might find genuinely surprising?
I think just the breadth of the potential connections. It's not just one thing, like Jevons and harvests. It's the claim that it touches recessions, social stability, geology, climate. That sheer interconnectedness between the sun and so many aspects of life on Earth. It really forces you to reconsider how isolated, or not, our planetary systems are.
That's a great point. It breaks down silos in a way.
It really does.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to carry forward. If our world really does dance, even partially, to these deep cosmic rhythms, if the sun is a player in our economic fate, how might understanding that fundamentally change how you plan? Your investments, sure, but maybe also your career, where you live, how you prepare for the future. What unexpected connections might you start noticing now if you look beyond the usual headlines?
Lots to mull over there.
Definitely. We hope this deep dive has sparked some new thoughts. Until next time, stay curious.